Welcome to day 81, and I think this is going to be a little shorter one today. We're looking at Joshua chapters 12 to 14 and 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Joshua is coming to the end of his life, coming to the end of the takeover of the area of Canaan, or the Promised Land, what today we refer to as Israel. And we've got a list of the kings and the peoples that have been defeated. There's also a list of the areas that have not yet been conquered. Joshua is aging, but it's clear that there's still a few things to do. We get a list of how they distribute the land to the tribes as God had instructed them to do. And we are reminded that while the people were in the wilderness, spies were sent out to prepare to enter the promised land, and only 2 of them were faithful to God and were confident that God was going to give the land to them, and they were Joshua and Caleb. At this point, they are both still alive, and Caleb comes to Joshua and say, "Hey, can I get a little bit of land? Because, hey, I was there for God, right at your side. We were faithful when no one else was." And so Joshua does give Caleb some land. And so we are reminded of the way that Joshua and Caleb have been faithful to God throughout their lives. And then we find out that there will be a little bit of a rest from war, at least for a period. Looking at 1 Corinthians 7, our last reading had some comments about sex and how our intimate relationships should be committed and long term. Now, Paul is talking about marriage and who can be married to each other and how they treat each other and who maybe should think about celibacy. He points out a couple things. One is that marriage is a relationship where each person is serving the other and satisfying the other. Another thing is that celibacy can be a gift and a wonderful thing for some people, but it is not a gift for all people, and that marriage is a gift that God gives to most people. And in verses 29 to 31, I think it's really interesting. Paul talks about keeping life simple. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday with fish fries and what we eat during Lent. But Paul is really advocating for a simpler life. How do we simplify our daily routines, our food, our shopping, our relationships? How do we limit the complications in our lives so that we have more time to be an instrument of God? I think this is a lot of the struggle that I hear a lot of people talking about at churches these days. We've got people coming to church, but they don't do anything at church. There's just a few people doing everything at church, and each of us has our own choices to make. Each of us has our own callings to answer. Some of us are called to be significant servants at church. Some of us are called to do the primary service work that we do in the community, to our neighbors, to our families, through our jobs. But most of us, I think, in the United States in 2025 are struggling with having taken on too much. We have bigger houses. I mean, if you drive around and you look at older neighborhoods, the houses are much smaller. The yards are much smaller. Cars used to be smaller. Many of us now have a vacation home or a camper that we use frequently on weekends. So that's a bigger complication, something else to take care of. How many different groups and activities are we in? How many groups and activities are our kids and grandkids in? And how many of them do we go to? When I was growing up, my grandparents never came to any of my baseball games. They came to a couple of my music recitals, but my grandparents didn't show up at stuff. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but my parents didn't even come. I was in high school tennis for a year, and my parents never came to a single match that I played in. They were at work and they had to stay at work. We have people now who actually change their jobs so they can be at their kids' activities. Now, I am not saying this to judge whether this is right or wrong. This may be the calling God has put in your life. But when we sit and we complain that we are busy, that we don't have enough money, that we don't have enough time, I think we have to seriously think about how we're not only budgeting our money, but how are we budgeting our time? And what have we budgeted for God in both our money and our time? Are we giving our lives as instruments for God's work in the world? Or are we filling our lives with the stuff we want to do, but making ourselves live a very complicated existence? It's a lot to think about this week, this day. We'll see you next time.